Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Lesson 2 of Unit 10, World War I. Now, before we start talking about World War I, I just want to emphasize to you that we're not going to be covering all the small little details of World War I. A lot of that information you covered in 7th grade, and you'll cover in as well as in high school. Instead, what we're going to focus in on in our lesson on World War I, notice it's just one lesson, is how it affected directly South Carolina. But a little bit of background information. Essential question: discuss the reasons for U.S. involvement in World War I and the war's impact or effects on South Carolina. Now, as we see here, which side did the U.S. enter the war to help? Did we fight with the French, Great Britain, or Russia as the United Fighters, the Entente powers, or were we on the Central Powers with Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, or with Bulgaria? Well, we all know that we fought with the French, the British, and the Russians, and we fought against Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. Now, President Woodrow Wilson, who was president during the time of World War I, issued a proclamation. He proclaimed neutrality when the war broke out. However, over time, that is going to change. He asked Congress to declare war on Germany when it resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. Said he wanted to make the world safe for democracy. He issued his 14 points, and in high school you'll go into the 14 points. And for the most part, South Carolina supported Wilson's point of view. He basically said, we're going to be neutral until Germany becomes offensive again, until they attack a civilian ship. And in this case, they actually did. The Lusitania was sunk by the Germans. It was a German U-boat, which is a German military boat, is going to sink a passenger ship called the Lusitania. 128 Americans were killed on this ship. Now, it's true that this ship was carrying artillery for the military purposes in Europe, but there were still civilians on this ship. Then Germany went on to sink 3 more American ships and we eventually declared war on Germany in April of 1917. Now, support for the war effort is going to grow quite a bit, and our involvement in the war is going to be very short-lived, but one of the most costly wars in world history. The AEF would affect the course of the war by deflecting the last push of the Germans on the Western Front in France. And as I said, November 11th of 1918, the war would officially end. Now, the interesting thing, look at that date, November 11th of 1918. It was first called Armistice Day, then it's going to go through an evolution of terms and eventually be called Veterans Day, November the 11th. Now, as I said, we're not going to focus in on battles and the war itself. Rather, we're going to focus in on how World War I affected South Carolina. Well, one, there's a resurgence or a growth in patriotism. The U.S. is going to reinstate the draft to where if you're a certain age and your number was drawn and you're a male, you're going into the military. Both black and white soldiers from South Carolina would fight. They were segregated. South Carolinians supported the war by buying war bonds and conserving food and fuel. Now, a bond is where you give money to the bank. The bank is then going to allow itself to give the money to the government, and in a certain number of years, you'll get your money back plus interest. So you're loaning the federal government money. Many South Carolinians would serve in the AEF with quite a bit of military distinction. And anti-German feelings are going to affect the treatment of German immigrants in South Carolina. A lot of German people who were good German people who were becoming American would actually leave not only the state but also the country out of fear of retaliation. The economic impact on South Carolina was quite extensive. New military bases would bring money in for South Carolina. Camp Jackson, present-day Fort Jackson in Columbia, plus additional bases in Greenville and Spartanburg. Charleston Naval Yard and the Marine Corps training camp at Parris Island would also be built. And farmers saw really good times. The rising prices and demand for these crops is going to allow them to grow more crops at a higher price for profit. But also the textile mills are going to profit from the demand of cotton fibers themselves. All right, so how the war affected African Americans in South Carolina? Because remember, there's still a rather large population of African Americans, and before the war, they were treated badly. During the war, African Americans are treated a little bit better, but the war itself and after the war, we're going to see some changes. So black soldiers who fought for freedom in Europe returned to a racist South Carolina. So think about it like this. You have fought for your country. You have suffered injuries, mentally and physically injuries, and you come back to a country that does not love you just as your white counterpart soldier. And so you see a lot of hatred, a lot of disdain at this time. 1919, South Carolina held a convention in Charleston to protest the Jim Crow laws and segregation. And this was obviously done by African Americans because they were fed up. They fought for America. They died for America, but they're not treated as Americans. We see race riots and lynchings increased and a revival or resurgence of the KKK. Over 100,000 African Americans left South Carolina and headed to northern states for even more economic opportunity and industry. They found economic independence and an opportunity that allowed them their culture to flourish. But they're not going to be able to run away from the racial tension, unfortunately, because that racial tension that they had in the South is going to also be in the North. Just because the Northerners weren't racist toward them in the beginning does not mean they won't be racist toward them in the end. I want you to go back through and review the video and review your study guide questions. Make sure to write down any questions that you have, as well as the major points of each one of the pages.